Hey y'all, Casey here. I've had a fondness for mythologies for most of my life. They're some of the most powerful stories out there, and despite being so old, they continue to resonate with people hundreds or even thousands of years after they were written or otherwise conjured up. They continue to resonate with people because at their core, they have eternal human truths. At the end of the day, mythological characters are, generally speaking, larger-than-life versions of real-life people with certain attributes amplified to tell stories or lessons about how humanity can behave. They help us to understand the eras they came from and even help us understand our current worlds. We can hold them up to ourselves as a mirror to see how humanity behaves at its best and at its worst. When most people think of mythologies, they think of Zeus and Odin, Ra and Venus. The word mythology tends to imply ancient pagan beliefs, but in reality, the term encompasses so much more. From the perspective of someone who doesn't believe in a given religion, the beings from those religions are similarly mythical, like Buddha, Jesus, Shiva, Krishna, or Muhammad. Wherever a system of religion exists, whether institutionalized or not, there lies mythology, at least from the point of view of someone who does not ascribe to that system of beliefs. Mythologies aren't just limited to what most people would call religions either. Cryptids are one example of mythologies that aren't connected to religious beliefs. Bigfoot, Chupacabra, Mothman, Paul Bunyan, and so many others are examples of American mythologies. I'm sure other countries have their own non-religious based mythologies, which I'd love to learn about, but for now, I'll focus on what I know, which is American mythologies. While the Jersey Devil and John Henry are like the pre-contemporary American Pegasus and Hercules, American mythologies have grown and shifted beyond them. What are the stories that we now tell again and again? The stories that are larger than life, but still have one foot in the real world. I would argue that those stories are the stories of superheroes. Modern American mythology springs from the pages of comic books. While it is true that most Americans may have not read an issue of Spider-Man or Superman, most Americans do know who Spider-Man and Superman are. It is relatively common knowledge that with great power comes great responsibility, even if most people couldn't say exactly where they know that from. Most people know that Superman puts on his glasses and becomes Clark Kent. The mythological status of superheroes has been further cemented by the wave of superhero movies that have been so successful over the past several decades. Just like in older mythologies, some characters become more popular than others and so are written about more than others. Since Batman and Superman are so popular, there are thousands of stories about each of them, while there are far fewer stories about characters like Moon Knight and Booster Gold. Similarly, we know quite a bit about Odin and Thor because so many stories were told about them, but we know relatively little about Tyr and Freyr, even though Tuesday is named after Tyr because far fewer mentions of them have survived or perhaps were ever told. The greatest gods, both new and old, have so many stories told about them that some might be surprised that they can maintain any sense of consistency. That consistency throughout different stories, though, is a key part of what makes something mythological. You can change lots of things about a mythological character from story to story, but there are always certain core principles or rules that must be maintained. Otherwise, that character stops being that same character. When done correctly, when a storyteller maintains those core rules, you can tell all sorts of great stories with mythological characters. A really good example of this done correctly was DC's Elseworlds stories. DC Comics used to publish stories with their characters in essentially alternate realities, and publish them under an imprint called Elseworlds. They would keep the basics of what made a character who they were, but they would change other things like the geographical location or the time period that the heroes existed in. Through maintaining these essential core elements, gods and other mythological characters can transcend the confines that we normal people find ourselves in. All storytellers and fans do not understand or perhaps agree with this concept, however. Some storytellers, publishers, and fans become hyper-obsessed with boxing characters into a very real-world-esque continuity or timeline. Rather than focusing on the core traits that make a character who they are, some people focus on every little choice a character makes or thing a character does as sacrosanct and written in stone. Woe unto anyone who forgets such earth-shattering important details like when Batman said his favorite juice was orange juice in issue number 695, because forgetting super important facts like that will cause all the superfans to lose their minds and set the internet on fire. Boxing larger-than-life characters into real-life confines is a great way to ruin a character, in my opinion. Core concepts, in my opinion, are so much more important than continuity. An added layer of intrigue when it comes to superheroes as modern American mythology is that some of the most prominent characters are inspired by other mythologies. Thor and Wonder Woman are two of the best examples, with Marvel's Thor and his realm being inspired by Norse mythology and Wonder Woman and her story being inspired by Greek mythology. This is, of course, not a new phenomenon either. Roman mythology was almost entirely inspired by Greek mythology, and Greek mythology was almost certainly inspired by even older mythologies. Certainly, a big part of superhero movies and their source material is made up of, at times, absurd fighting sequences, but there is so much more to them. The Jessica Jones TV show is an incredible story about abuse and the difficulties in overcoming it. WandaVision is a story about dealing with loss and trauma. Those are two of my favorites, but they are far from the only superhero stories with more than just expensive special effects and choreographed fight scenes. Most of the best superhero stories are the best because they have something bigger at their core, some larger message that resonates with people. The X-Men are famously used to tell great stories about people who are marginalized by larger society for being who they are. During their original run of comics, they were a frequent stand-in for the civil rights movement. I always gravitated towards them because I was able to read them as being about what it was like to be a queer person in the world. Much like mythologies of old, superheroes are frequently a vehicle for discussing current events. It seems like all media takes a stand on current events nowadays. But that was not always the case. You used to have to be sort of covert about it, which things like superhero comics were able to do. Superhero comics were seen as being on the fringe, so they were able to get away with discussing things that other mediums wouldn't touch. Like in the 70s when Green Arrow's sidekick Speedy was revealed to be addicted to heroin to discuss issues around drug abuse. One thing to make superheroes different from mythologies of the past is the fact that we're aware they're not real. We, the readers and viewers, are aware that Peter Parker and Bruce Wayne don't really exist. At least, not the same Peter Parker who has a spidey sense, and not the same Bruce Wayne who can seemingly solve any problem except how to keep villains behind bars. That awareness, for better or worse, allows us to approach our modern mythologies from a different perspective than older cultures. I'm not the only person to have thought this either. Grant Morrison wrote a book that I believe is along the same lines called Super Gods. Ironically, Neil Gaiman's American Gods, which is an exceptional book, is not exactly about this, but does discuss American mythology in its own way. It seems to me that the prevalence of superheroes in American culture is only going to grow for the time being. The number of conventions centered around superheroes has increased exponentially over the past several decades. They've spread from the big screen to the small screen with huge success. You can now even walk amongst facsimiles of these titans in theme parks. I'm intrigued as to what stories will be told with these godlike characters in the future, as their presence continues to grow. America is not the only country to have adopted a modern mythology based in superheroes. Japan certainly has a rich comic book superhero culture as well. India has done some really interesting things with turning gods into superheroes in almost a reverse American move. I've tried to look into this phenomenon in other countries too, but to varying success. I would love to learn about modern mythologies in other countries as well. So if you know of any, especially if they're from your country, drop them in the comments. Anyways, thanks for watching. If you got something out of this video, please click that like button and subscribe. Until next time.